The rain had been falling since noon. By the time the torches were lit along the fence posts of Harlan's yard, the ground had turned to something between mud and memory. Thick, sucking, the kind of earth that held on to whatever touched it and didn't let go easy. The cattle pens stood empty on the west side. They hadn't held animals in years. Everyone in the territory knew what Harlan's yard traded now, and most of them had learned not to ask too many questions about it. The yard sat at the edge of what people loosely called Cutter's Crossing. Not a town exactly, more of a collection of stubborn structures that refused to blow down. There was a saloon that doubled as a courthouse on days when the circuit judge bothered to ride through. There was a supply store run by a man named Gideon Fail, who weighed his thumbs along with everything else he sold. There was a livery, a blacksmith, 3 churches competing for the same 20 souls, and a post office that hadn't received a legitimate federal mail contract in 11 years. And there was Harlan's yard, which had no sign out front because it didn't need one. Everyone knew what happened there. The women who passed through Harlan's yard came from everywhere and nowhere. Some had been sold by families too desperate or too cruel to carry the weight of them. Some had been taken under the cover of debt, a father's gambling loss, a husband's unpaid bill, a contract signed under duress that somehow always ended the same way. Some had simply been unlucky enough to be traveling alone when the wrong men found them. They arrived in Harlan's yard frightened and left it owned. That was the business. Selene Crow had been inside that yard for 3 days when her body decided it was done waiting. But she was 18 years old and had been property for 6 of those years. She didn't remember much about life before. There were fragments. A mother's voice, the smell of baking bread, the sound of a creak behind a house she could no longer picture clearly. But the years had worn those edges smooth, the way water wears stone, until the memories felt more like feelings than actual events. Warm, gone, not hers to hold anymore. What she remembered clearly, with the kind of precision that only pain produces, was the day she arrived at Harlan's yard. It had been a Tuesday. She remembered because the man who transferred her, her third owner, a wool merchant from the Eastern Territories named Stills, who smelled of lanolin and self-justification, had complained about losing 2 days of travel time. He'd said it mattered because he had a shipment arriving Thursday. He'd said it the way men like him said everything, as though the inconvenience was hers. She'd been passed from Stills to a heavy-set man called Dobe, who ran intake at the yard. Dobe had looked her over the way you look over a horse before purchase, checking teeth, checking posture, checking for damage that might affect the price. He'd noticed the pregnancy immediately. How far along, he'd asked. 7 months, she'd said. He'd made a note on his ledger and assigned her a pen near the east wall. He hadn't been cruel about it. That was the worst part sometimes. When they weren't cruel about it. Cruelty you could hold on to. Indifference just swallowed you whole. The contractions had started around midday on the 3rd day, which was also the day Harlan had scheduled the auction. She'd tried to stay quiet about it. She knew what happened when you became inconvenient. She'd seen women disappear from yards like this, sent somewhere worse when the calculus of profit shifted against them. A woman in active labor was a liability at an auction. She understood that with the cold, clear logic that surviving long enough tends to install in a person. But her body wasn't interested in her strategy. By mid-afternoon, the pain had moved from manageable to absolute, and the woman in the adjacent pen, a gray-haired woman named Cass, who'd been through Harlan's yard twice before and had the particular weariness of someone who'd stopped being surprised by anything, had come as close to the chain link as she could and talked Selene through the breathing. "Don't clench," Cass had said, low and steady. "I know it hurts. Don't clench anyway. Opens up better if you don't fight it." "I always fight it," Selene had managed through her teeth. "I know. Try anyway." The rain had started around 4 in the afternoon, which was also when Selene understood that Harlan wasn't going to delay the auction. She heard him outside the pen doors talking to Dobe. She couldn't hear every word through the rain and the thunder and the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears, but she heard enough. "Move the girl through quick. Don't let her draw attention to herself. She's having the baby, Harlan. I don't know that she can walk, can't she?" A pause. "Maybe. Then she can stand on the block. Get her a cloth." She did walk. She walked because the alternative was being dragged, and she had decided years ago that she would never be dragged again if she could help it. It was the only dignity left to her. The choice of how she moved through the indignities she couldn't prevent. They'd put a rough wool blanket around her shoulders against the rain. The chain at her wrist was attached to a longer line that connected her to the processing order. 3 other women ahead of her, 2 behind. Cass was not among them. Cass had been through this enough times that her paperwork was clean, and she'd gone through earlier in the afternoon before the storm really hit. Selene would think about Cass for years afterward, wonder where she ended up, hope it was somewhere with windows. The auction block at Harlan's yard was elevated about 18 inches off the ground, just enough to put you on display, not enough to feel like a stage. It was raw lumber, warped from previous rains, with a railing on one side that had been nailed back on at least twice. There were torches and iron brackets on either side that the rain kept trying to put out. A man named Pratt ran the calling. He had a loud voice and the particular smile of someone who'd separated himself so completely from what he did that he'd stopped seeing it. The buyers stood under a canvas lean-to that had been strung up on the yard's south side. There were maybe 20 of them. Selene didn't look at their faces. She'd learned not to years ago. Looking at faces made you see them as people, and people could feel you looking, and feeling you looking sometimes made them angry. She looked at the fence post directly across from the block. It had a rusted nail at eye level. She focused on the nail. The rain hit her face. Thunder rolled somewhere to the north, close enough that several horses tied along the west fence startled and pulled at their lines. She was standing on the block when the baby came. It wasn't the way it happens in stories. There was no dramatic moment of water and then sudden arrival. It was slower than that, and more terrible, and more undignified, and the pain was the kind of pain that rearranges things inside you, not just physically, but in some deeper architecture that you don't have a name for until it changes. She didn't fall. That was the thing she would remember most clearly, later, that she did not fall. Pratt stopped the calling. There was a strange hush across the yard, even from the buyers under the lean-to. Even from men who did business in a place like this and had convinced themselves it was ordinary commerce. Even they went quiet. Selene was on her knees on the auction block, in the rain, with Dobe suddenly beside her doing something he almost certainly hadn't planned to do that afternoon, because whatever else he was, he'd once told her he had a daughter of his own, and sometimes that matters in ways people can't fully explain even to themselves. "I've got you," Dobe said low, not the voice he used for business. "I've got you, girl." The baby was born under open sky, in the rain, on an auction block in a cattle yard at the edge of a town that barely deserved the name. She was small. She was loud. She was furious at the cold world she'd arrived in, and she announced her displeasure at full volume. Selene held her against her chest, both of them shaking, and looked down at this tiny thing she'd made, this small, red-faced creature who had no idea where she was or what she'd been born into, and felt something so complicated it took years to find a word for it. Not joy exactly, not grief exactly, something that contained both without being either. "She's all right?" Selene asked. Her voice was someone else's voice, scraped and far away. "She's all right," Dobb said. He'd taken off his coat, his actual coat, the one he wore, and wrapped the baby in it. The rain kept falling. After a while, Pratt cleared his throat and said, We're going to take a short break in the proceedings." Nobody argued with him. So they let her sit for 40 minutes. Someone brought water. Someone else brought a cloth and a piece of bread, which Selene ate with the blank automatic urgency of a body that has been through something and requires fuel regardless of what the mind thinks about it. The baby had stopped crying. She was pressed against Selene's chest, eyes closed, apparently undisturbed by the thunder. Selene looked down at her. "You picked a hell of a day," she said quietly. The baby did not respond, which felt about right. When they came to put her back in the line, she stood. Her legs were uncertain under her. The chain at her wrist had been transferred to a shorter one to keep her from having to drag the slack, some small accommodation that she was almost embarrassed to feel grateful for. She was still grateful. She stood on the block a second time. Pratt called her lot with slightly less enthusiasm than he'd had before the break. The rain had thinned to a drizzle, which meant the torches were holding. Selene found the rusted nail on the fence post and fixed her eyes on it. She held the baby against her chest with her free arm. She had decided, somewhere in the 40 minutes of sitting on the ground in the mud, that she would not beg and she would not cry, and she would not look at whoever purchased her with any expression at all. She would give them nothing to feel about. That was the only territory left to her, and she intended to hold it. The bidding started. It wasn't brisk. A woman who'd just given birth on an auction block was not ideal inventory from a purely transactional standpoint, and the baby complicated things further. Some buyers would see it as a liability, others as a separate commodity, and neither of those calculations was something Selene let herself think about directly, because some thoughts were too dangerous to have while you needed to remain functional. Two men were bidding. She didn't look at them. Then a third voice entered. It was a quiet voice. Not the aggressive volume of men who bid to demonstrate dominance. Not the calculated understatement of men who bid to conceal interest. Just a voice from the back of the lean-to, stating a number that stopped the other two completely. She heard Pratt hesitate. Sir, I know what it is, the voice said. Is there a counter? There wasn't. Peace. She still didn't look at him when he came forward to complete the transaction. She heard the paperwork moving, heard Pratt's voice doing the procedural confirmation that transformed human beings into line items in a ledger. She stood with the baby and focused on the rusted nail. Then the chain was unfastened from her wrist. She hadn't expected that. She flinched when she felt hands at the chain, an involuntary full-body recoil that she was immediately furious at herself for. 6 years of training her body not to react without permission, and her wrist still pulled back like a frightened animal. Easy, the quiet voice said. Not a command, not reassurance exactly, just a word. The way you might speak to something that had been hurt and didn't know yet whether the new situation was better or worse than the last one. She looked at him then. He was tall, not aggressively so, but tall in the way of men who'd done physical work most of their lives, where the height came with actual weight behind it, rather than the lean showiness of someone performing strength. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and a beard that suggested he didn't think about it much. His coat was good quality, but had seen considerable weather. His hands, she noticed. She always noticed hands first. As a matter of survival, were large and calloused and holding the chain she'd just been attached to, like it was something that made him uncomfortable. He looked at her and didn't look away, which most men did when they realized she'd caught them looking. He also didn't look at her the way buyers looked at inventory, which was the look she'd spent years learning to file away into a part of herself that didn't have to feel it directly. He looked at her like she was a person, like she was a specific, complicated person, and he was trying to figure out who she was and didn't think he had the right to assume. It unnerved her more than anything else had. I have a wagon, he said, whenever you're ready. I'm ready now, she said, because she was always ready to leave places like this. He nodded. He turned and walked toward the yard gate, and she followed him because she didn't have another option that she could see, and also because something in the way he'd said whenever you're ready had lodged itself in her chest in a place she couldn't immediately identify or explain. It was only later, much later, after she'd stopped waiting for the other side of it to show itself, that she understood what had bothered her about those 3 words. No one had said anything like that to her in 6 years. The wagon was an old farm rig, the kind built for practicality over comfort, solid axles, good wheels, a flatbed with a raised bench seat, and a canvas cover stretched over iron hoops in the back. There were blankets in the bed. Clean ones, she noted, though she told herself she was noting it only for practical purposes. He helped her up without touching her more than the offered hand, which she took because the step was too high with the baby in her arm, and she wasn't going to fall out of stubbornness when she'd already survived everything else today. He went around to the driver's side and climbed up, gathered the reins, and clicked the horses into motion without looking at her. She appreciated that. She was very tired of being looked at. They rode in silence through the mud tracks of Cutter's Crossing. A few people on the street watched them pass. She looked back at them with nothing on her face. They looked away. The town dissolved behind them into dark road and drizzle and the smell of pine from the mountains that rose in the distance like a suggestion of somewhere else. She was watching the mountains when he spoke. "My name's Rowan Mercer," he said. "I have a ranch about 2 hours north of here. I'm going back to it now." He paused. "You don't owe me anything." She turned and looked at him. He was watching the road. "What?" she said. "For the price, what I paid back there." He said it like he was clarifying a position, not offering a gift. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel indebted. I'm telling you so you know the situation clearly. What happened back there? I don't expect anything from it. She stared at him for a long moment. She had met men who said things that sounded like this, who led with generosity as a mechanism, who built credit with kindness the way merchants built credit with loans, expecting compound interest on the back end. She'd learned to recognize the signs, the slight lean toward you when they said it, the watching to see how you received it, the particular softness in the voice that was performing softness rather than actually being soft. He wasn't doing any of that. He was watching the road. His voice was level. He sounded, if anything, mildly uncomfortable, like a man who'd said something he felt needed saying and didn't particularly enjoy saying it. She filed that information away and kept watching him. Then what do you expect? She asked. Nothing, he said. I have a spare room. You can stay until you figure out what you want to do. And if I decide I want to go somewhere else, then I'll drive you to wherever you're going. She was quiet. The wagon hit a rut and bounced, and the baby stirred against her chest and made a small disgruntled noise and then settled again. Selene adjusted her grip. You do this kind of thing often? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, no. Then why now? Another pause. Longer this time. She watched his jaw tighten very slightly, then release. I had a sister, he said. That's all I want to say about it right now. She turned back to the road. She understood that sentence. Not the details of it, not yet, but the shape of it. The way it ended a line of inquiry without hostility. The way it offered information and closed the door behind it, politely, because the room it opened onto was not a room for strangers. She understood that completely. All right, she said. They rode in silence the rest of the way to the mountains. She didn't sleep on the wagon, though her body was pulling toward it with the desperate gravity of profound exhaustion. She stayed awake deliberately, watching the landscape change around them. The flat scrub of the lowlands giving way to the first scattered trees, then denser forest, then the road narrowing into something that required actual navigating rather than just pointing forward. The baby slept. She breathed in a rapid, shallow rhythm that Selene had been watching with the obsessive vigilance of someone who knew, with absolute bone-deep certainty, that this small creature's continued breathing was the most important thing in the world, and that it was her responsibility, and that she had failed at every other responsibility she'd ever been given, and that she would not fail at this one. She didn't know where that certainty had come from. It had simply arrived, somewhere around the moment she'd first held her, and it hadn't left. She looked down at the baby's face in the dim light. Small nose, dark lashes, a crease across her cheek from the coat she'd been wrapped in. I don't know your name yet, she said quietly, mostly to herself. You could take your time with it, Rowan said from his side of the bench. She'd thought he wasn't listening. She looked over. Names matter, he said. He wasn't looking at her. No need to rush it. She turned back to the baby. Yeah, she said. They do. The ranch came into view around what she estimated was 2 a.m, a collection of low structures in a mountain clearing, a main house with a covered porch, 2 outbuildings, a barn that showed light under the door from the animals inside. There was a fence line and a vegetable garden that was mostly winter dead, but had the organized bones of something tended. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, audible before it was visible. It was nothing like what she'd expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Some version of worse, she supposed, filtered through the accumulated experience of 6 years of worse. But this place had a quality she didn't have a word for immediately, like it had been built with intention rather than just expediency. Like someone had thought about it, had made choices about where to put things and why. Rowan pulled the wagon up beside the house and climbed down. He didn't come around to help her down this time. She registered this as deliberate, that he'd helped her once because the step was genuinely difficult with the baby, and now he was letting her manage without the implicit transaction of being assisted. She climbed down herself, the baby pressed against her shoulder, and her legs held. He pushed the front door open and reached inside to light a lamp. Kitchen's through there, he said from the doorway. There's food if you're hungry. Spare room is down the hall on the left. The bed's made up. Privy's out the back door, 30 feet east. You'll see the path. He paused. That's it. I'll be in the barn for a while, seeing to the horses." She stood in the yard looking at him. "You're not coming in?" "Not until you've been in there first," he said. "Had time to see the layout, know where everything is." She stared. He said nothing else, just waited. She walked past him through the door. The kitchen was warm, the stove still holding heat from earlier in the day. There was a table with 4 chairs, a shelf of dishes, a cast iron pot with something in it that smelled like it had been soup a few hours ago and could be reheated. The floor was clean. The windows had curtains, which shouldn't have meant anything to her and meant a great deal. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with the baby and felt something she didn't immediately trust. It felt like, and she was very careful about this word, very suspicious of it, it felt like the absence of threat, not safety. She didn't know safety well enough to recognize it, but the absence of the specific pressure she'd lived under for so long, the watching, the readiness, the constant calculation of what was coming and how bad. It was so unfamiliar that it felt almost physically strange, like suddenly being in a room where a noise you'd stopped hearing had finally stopped. She sat down at the kitchen table. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when Rowan came in from the barn. He stopped when he saw her. She hadn't moved, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything except sit with the baby in her arms. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm trying to figure out what the catch is," she said. He crossed to the stove and checked the pot. "No catch." "Everyone says that." "I know." He ladled soup into a bowl without being asked, set it on the table in front of her, set a spoon beside it. "I can't prove it to you tonight. I wouldn't expect you to believe it tonight." He sat down across from her, not crowding, the full width of the table between them. "Eat something. The room's yours. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." She looked at the soup. She looked at him. "What if I decide to leave tomorrow?" "Then you leave. Just like that. Just like that." She picked up the spoon. She ate, slowly, watching him over the rim of the bowl. He didn't talk. He got himself a cup of coffee and sat with it and looked at something on the table that he clearly wasn't seeing, somewhere private in his own head, not performing calm but actually just calm. Or something close enough that she couldn't tell the difference. The baby made a small sound. Selene shifted her. "She needs something?" Rowan asked. "She's fine. She does that." He nodded and went back to his coffee. Selene finished the soup. She set the bowl down. "I'm going to the room," she said. "All right." She stood. She walked to the hallway. She stopped in the doorway without turning around. "Rowan Mercer," she said. "Yes." "If this turns out to be a lie, I will find a way to make it very unpleasant for you." A pause. Then with no effect, no defensiveness, no humor that wasn't earned. "That seems fair." She walked down the hall to the room. The bed was made with a gray wool blanket and a pillow that smelled like cedar. The window had a curtain. There was a small table with a candle on it that she lit and then watched for a while in the dark. The baby was asleep against her. She lay down without undressing, on top of the blanket, with the baby against her chest, and stared at the ceiling, and waited for the sound of steps in the hallway that would tell her she'd been wrong. They didn't come. An hour passed. Then 2. She was still awake, or something adjacent to awake, when she heard him moving through the house, not toward her room, but toward his own, further down the hall. The quiet sound of a door closing. She stared at the ceiling. The candle burned down. In the dark, the baby breathed. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in the sound that pines make. A specific, ancient sound that has no human equivalent, just the mountain talking to itself. Selene lay in the dark in a room with a curtained window and no chain at her wrist. And she did not sleep for a very long time, because freedom, when you've never had it, doesn't feel like rest. It feels like the held breath before something else happens. It took her a long time to understand that sometimes nothing else happens. That sometimes the held breath is just air. In the morning, she found him already outside before the light was full, splitting wood alongside the barn. He didn't acknowledge her immediately, just finished the log he was working on, set the axe down, and said, "Coffee's on the stove, there's bread on the shelf, help yourself to whatever's there." She stood on the porch. The mountains were visible now, fully, in a morning light that was sharp and clean after last night's rain. The clearing spread out around the house. Maybe 5 acres, she estimated, with the forest coming in close on 3 sides. She could see the creek from here. She could see the garden. She could see very clearly that there was no fence around the property. No wall, no locked gate, no boundary that would contain her. She looked at that fact for a long moment. Then she went inside and poured herself coffee. She was sitting at the kitchen table when she heard his boots on the porch steps, and then his voice from just outside the door. "She have a name yet?" Selene looked down at the baby, who was lying on the blanket across the table's surface, apparently fascinated by the ceiling. "I've been thinking about Aurora," Selene said. A pause. Then, "That's a good name." She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, not coming in yet, just standing there with the morning light behind him and an expression she was still learning to read. Not the performed warmth of someone who wanted something, just attention. Like a person looking at something they found interesting and weren't sure what to make of yet. "What happened to your sister?" she asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. She wasn't sure why she did. His expression didn't close. It shifted. Something settling behind his eyes that wasn't grief exactly, or wasn't only grief, but the long residue of grief that's had time to become part of the landscape. "She was taken," he said, "about 4 years ago, passing through a town further east." He paused. "She was 17. Selene looked at him. "Did you find her?" she asked. "No," he said. "I looked for a long time, but no." The morning was quiet around them. Somewhere in the forest, a bird was conducting some kind of argument with itself. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it. He nodded. "I know you are." He stepped inside and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. And there was something in the way he moved through the kitchen, like a man who'd been alone in a space for a while and had learned to take up only his own portion of it, that told her a great deal about what kind of person he was. She picked up Aurora and held her. "I don't know how to trust people," Selene said. It came out flat, factual, without apology. "I used to, but I've learned that it isn't safe. So I'm telling you that now so you understand why I'm going to be careful," he said. "Careful," she confirmed. "That's fine," he said. "Take all the time you need." She looked at him over the top of Aurora's head. "You keep saying things like that," she said. "Things like what?" "Things that sound like you mean them." He met her eyes. "I do mean them." "Why?" He thought about it for a moment. Actually thought, didn't reach for a ready answer. "Because of my sister," he said finally. "Because I kept thinking about what she must have needed, what someone could have offered her that might have made a difference. And the answer I kept coming back to was just that, time. The right to take time." He looked at his coffee. "I couldn't give it to her," he said. "So." Selene held Aurora against her chest. Outside, the creek ran. The mountains held their position. The morning came in through the window and lay across the kitchen floor in a patch of light that moved very slowly as the sun shifted. It was, she thought, the most ordinary morning she'd had in 6 years. She didn't know what to do with it. She held her daughter and drank her coffee, and she watched Rowan Mercer across the table, and she didn't feel safe. She didn't know how to feel safe, hadn't known for a very long time, but she felt something. She felt for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, like she might be allowed to find out what happened next. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, almost everything. The first week she slept with the door latched. Not locked. There was no lock, and she'd checked, running her fingers along the doorframe the first morning with the methodical thoroughness of someone taking inventory of available defenses. No lock. Just a simple iron latch that a child could lift from outside if they knew where to press. She'd propped a chair under the handle anyway, angled just so, and told herself it was habit rather than fear, which was the kind of lie you tell yourself when the truth is too exhausting to look at directly. Rowan didn't mention it. He didn't mention a lot of things, which she was still trying to decide was a virtue or a strategy. The days had a shape to them that she hadn't expected. He was up before light, out to the barn, back inside by the time she came out of her room. Coffee already made. Whatever he'd found for breakfast laid out on the shelf, bread, dried fruit, salt pork when he'd had time to fry it. He didn't wait for her to eat with him. He ate before she was up and was already back at whatever work the day required by the time she made it to the kitchen. She thought at first that he was avoiding her. Then she realized he simply kept the same schedule regardless of whether anyone else was there, and that her being in the house hadn't altered his routine because he wasn't performing a routine for her benefit. He just lived this way. That realization sat strangely with her. She turned it over for several days before she understood why. Every other man who'd had ownership of her, formal or otherwise, had organized their behavior around her presence. What she did, where she went, how she moved through a space, all of it had existed in relation to them. Their comfort, their convenience, their requirements. She had been, in the most practical sense, the center of someone else's attention at all times. And that attention had been a kind of constant pressure, even when it wasn't hostile, even when it dressed itself as care. Rowan Mercer organized his behavior around his ranch, his animals, his work. She was in his house, and she was a person he was responsible for in the sense of having offered shelter, but he was not watching her. He was not tracking her movements. He was not waiting to see what she did so he could respond to it. It should have been a relief. It was, in fact, deeply unsettling. She found herself watching him instead, through the kitchen window while he worked the fence line, from the porch while he moved between the barn and the outbuildings, in the evenings when he came in and sat with whatever mending needed doing, or the account book he kept with the focused, slightly unhappy expression of a man who found numbers necessary rather than interesting. She watched him the way she'd learned to watch people who had power over her, looking for the seams in what they showed, the places where the presentation slipped, and you could see what was underneath. She didn't find seams. That was somehow the most alarming part. Aurora was 3 weeks old when Selene finally asked him directly about the money. She'd been calculating it for days. She didn't know the precise figure. She'd been on the block when it was called, not in a position to track the bidding carefully, but she'd been in enough yards to have a working sense of what things cost, and what she'd understood from the size of the reaction around her was that whatever he'd paid, it was substantial. Substantially more than she was worth on the market in her condition. Substantially more than practical investment could justify. She found him in the barn in the late afternoon, running a brush over the bay mare's flank with the particular patience of a man who liked horses more than he liked most situations. "How much did you pay for me?" she asked from the doorway. He didn't stop brushing. "Doesn't matter." "It matters to me." He was quiet for a moment. The mare shifted her weight and stamped once and settled. 1,200, he said. She thought she was prepared for a number. She wasn't, quite. $1,200 was a year's income for a working man. More than that, out here. She stood in the barn doorway and did the math and felt something that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite fury, but had elements of both. The specific ugliness of knowing exactly how you've been valued and by whom and in what direction the numbers moved. "You could have bought land with that," she said. "I have land." "More land." "I have enough land." He moved to the horse's other side. "I had the money. I don't anymore. It doesn't create an obligation between us." "It creates something," she said. He looked at her then, over the mare's back. His expression was the same as it usually was. Measured, not performed, attending to her the way he attended to everything that required attention in his life. "I had a reason," he said. "I told you the reason, my sister. I'm not going to pretend it was charity and I had no self-interest in it, because that would be a lie, and you'd know it was a lie. But the self-interest I had is mine to carry, not yours. You don't owe me anything for my own reasons." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a strange man," she said. "Probably," he said, and went back to the horse. She stood there another moment, not because there was anything left to say, but because she was still doing the calculation, not of money this time, but of something else, something that didn't have a clean unit of measurement. Trust, maybe. Or the possibility of trust, or the distance between where she was and where trust might begin to be something she could contemplate without feeling like she was setting herself up for a fall she wouldn't survive. She walked back to the house. She took the chair out from under the door handle that night. She put it back against the wall where chairs belonged. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. And she told herself it didn't mean anything, and she told herself she'd put it back tomorrow if anything happened. And then she listened to the house settle around her in the dark and tried to figure out if what she was feeling was anything close to safe. It wasn't safe. She knew that. She knew better than to call it safe. But it was quieter than it had been. And quiet, she was learning, was its own category of thing that she hadn't had enough of to know the value of. She fell asleep before she found the word for it. Aurora slept beside her, breathing. The pines moved in the dark outside. And nothing happened. 3 weeks passed that way. Then 4. The shape of the days began to acquire texture. She started cooking in the evenings because it gave her something to do with her hands, and because she was better at it than Rowan, who cooked the way a man cooks when he's been alone for a while. Adequately, without interest, producing results that were nutritious without being particularly worth eating. She didn't announce that she was taking over the cooking. She just started doing it. He noticed, said nothing, and began to clean up after meals, which had previously been her job, without discussion or negotiation. It was an exchange that happened entirely without words, which was, she was beginning to understand, how a lot of things happened with Rowan Mercer. She was at the stove one evening, Aurora in a sling she'd made from a piece of canvas she'd found in the supply room, when she heard him come in from outside and stop in the kitchen doorway. "Something smells like actual food," he said. "It is actual food," she said without turning around. "What have you been eating up here for the past however long?" "Things," he said. "Things." She turned the pan. "That's a concerning answer." "I get by." "I believe you get by. Getting by isn't the same as eating." There was a pause, and then the sound of him washing his hands at the basin by the back door. She heard the chair scrape back from the table. "Where'd you learn to cook?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. It was the first time he'd asked her something about her past that wasn't clearly operational. Not where do you want to go or what do you need, but a question about who she'd been before. "The first house I was in," she said. "The woman there, the wife, she didn't like me near her husband, so she kept me in the kitchen." She paused. "I didn't mind it. The kitchen was the warmest room in winter, and nobody bothered me there." She heard him not respond, which was its own kind of response. The response of someone who understood that some things don't need a comment, just acknowledgement that they've been heard. "You can ask me things," she said, still facing the stove. "I know you've been not asking." "I noticed you might tell me when you were ready," he said. Seemed more useful than asking. She glanced over her shoulder at him. He was looking at the table. "You're careful," she said. "I try to be." She turned back to the stove. "My mother died when I was 12, she said. "There wasn't anyone else. There was a neighbor who offered to take me in, and I didn't know enough to understand what that meant, so I went." She kept her voice level. She'd told this story before to various people, and she'd learned that the level voice was necessary. Not because the story didn't hurt, but because if she let it hurt while she was telling it, she'd lose the thread. "He sold me 18 months later to a man passing through. I don't think he thought of it that way. I think he thought of it as something else. People are very good at finding different names for the same thing." Minutes. "Yes," Rowan said. "Just that. I had 3, I don't know what to call them. Owners is the word, but I don't like saying it." She pulled the pan off the heat. "Stills was the last. You know what happened after Stills?" "Yes," he said again. She plated the food and brought it to the table. She sat across from him, which had become where she sat, which had become, without either of them deciding it, the arrangement. Aurora was still in the sling, warm against her chest. "Your turn," she said. He looked up. "You said you had a sister," she said, "and a family buried by tragedy. Those were your words." His jaw moved slightly, not defensiveness, something older. "My parents died in a fever outbreak when I was 22, he said. "Margaret, my sister, was 15. We had the ranch, just the two of us. She was good at this place, better than me at some things. She had a way with the animals that I've never—" He stopped, set down his fork, picked it up again. "When she was taken, I was in town. A 3-day supply run. I came back and she was gone. The hands we had were 2 old-timers who'd been with my parents. They didn't see anything, they said. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they were scared and said what was easier." He shook his head. "I spent 2 years looking. Hired investigators when I could afford it. Followed leads to 4 different territories." He paused. The leads all ended. She held his gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, which was what she'd said before, but she meant it more precisely now, with the specifics behind it. "She'd be 20 now," he said. If He didn't finish that sentence. He picked up his fork and ate, and she let him, because she understood exactly the shape of an unfinished sentence like that one. They ate in a quiet that was different from the earlier quiet, denser, shared, the way silence gets when two people have put something real into the room, and neither of them knows what to do with it yet. After a while, Aurora made a sound, and Selene shifted the sling, and Rowan watched without pretending he wasn't watching. "She's getting bigger," he said. "She is. She looks—" He seemed to reconsider something. "She looks like she's going to be loud." Selene glanced down at Aurora, who had the particular expression of a baby who has recently decided the world is interesting. "She already is loud." "Good," he said. "Kids should be loud." She looked at him. There was something in the way he'd said it. Not sentimental, not performed warmth, just a flat conviction, like a thing he believed the way he believed in checking fence lines or maintaining tools. Something about that flatness made it more real than anything flowery would have been. She looked down at Aurora. "Yeah," she said, "they should." The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, which was a day Selene would mark in her memory, not by the weather or what she'd been doing, but by the particular sound of a wagon coming up the road too fast for a social call. She was in the yard with Aurora when she heard it. That specific urgency in the wheel speed, the way horses sound when they're being pushed rather than guided. She looked up and saw two men on a buckboard, both of them dressed for business rather than ranch work, both of them looking at the house with the focused assessment of people who know exactly where they're going and why. She was inside the house with Aurora before they stopped the wagon. She didn't know why she went inside. Instinct, or the accumulated training of 6 years that said, when men you don't know arrive moving fast, you get out of sight and wait to see what they want. She watched through the kitchen window. Rowan came out of this barn before the men had climbed down, which told her he'd heard the wagon too, and had the same instinct about its speed. He stood in the yard with his hands loose at his sides, not threatening, not welcoming, and waited. The men climbed down. One of them was heavy, dressed in a dark coat with a gold watch chain that caught the afternoon light. The other was thin and younger, carrying a document case. "Mr. Mercer," the heavy man said. "My name is Culver Aldis. I represent a coalition of business interests in the Eastern Territories, and we've been made aware of a recent transaction at the Harlan yard that may involve property under existing contractual claim." Selene pressed her hand against the window frame. "Property," Rowan said. His voice was completely flat. "The woman and child," Aldis said, without hesitation or apparent discomfort. "We have documentation establishing prior claim, contracts executed before her arrival in Cutter's Crossing, involving debt obligations tied to her former holder." He nodded to the thin man who opened the document case. "We're prepared to offer you full reimbursement of your purchase price, plus a reasonable percentage above. We can conclude this today if you're willing to be cooperative." Rowan looked at the documents the thin man was holding out. He didn't take them. "And if I'm not willing to be cooperative," he said. Aldis's expression rearranged itself into something that was almost a smile. "Then this moves into the courts. The territory courts tend to take a dim view of contested claims being ignored, Mr. Mercer, and you'd be looking at a legal process that could take a year or more, with an uncertain outcome." Selene was watching Rowan's back from the window. She couldn't see his face, but she could see his shoulders, and she watched them do something. A very small movement, like a decision being made in the body before the mind has fully caught up. "Ride back to town," he said. "Don't come up this road again." Aldis blinked. "Mr. Mercer, I don't think you understand the nature of what—" "I understand it fine," Rowan said. "I'm telling you to leave." A pause. Aldis looked at the thin man. The thin man looked at the document case. "You're making a significant mistake," Aldis said. "Maybe," Rowan said. "Leave anyway." They left. Selene watched the wagon go back down the road the way it had come, moving with slightly less urgency now, and rather more hostility. She stood at the window until it was out of sight. Then she put Aurora down on the blanket on the floor, which was the safest flat surface available, and sat down on the kitchen floor next to her, because her legs had decided they were done with standing for the moment. Rowan came in a few minutes later. He looked at her on the floor and didn't say anything about it, just sat down in the kitchen chair directly above her so they were at different heights, but in the same general vicinity, which felt somehow like the right arrangement. "What were those documents?" she asked. Probably real, he said. Probably tied to something Stills signed before he transferred you to Harlan. Debt instruments tend to have subordination clauses in them. It's how men like Aldous make money. They buy old debts for pennies and then chase the interest. He paused. It's legal, depending on how you read the territory statutes. And territory courts tend to read them in ways that favor the men who buy drinks for judges. So they have a real claim. They have a document that says they have a claim, he said. Those are sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. She looked up at him. Rowan. She said his name deliberately, the way you say a name when you need someone to take you seriously. If this goes to court and they have valid papers, you lose. You lose the money you paid, they get me back, and you've burned your savings for nothing. He looked at the window where the wagon had been. That's one outcome, he said. What's the other outcome? The other outcome is I take those documents apart and find every flaw in them and make the legal cost of pursuing this higher than whatever it's worth to Aldis's coalition. He paused. And if that doesn't work, I make sure there's nothing left to claim, legally. She stared at him. What does that mean? He met her eyes. Something in his expression was very deliberate, like a man who has made up his mind about something and is watching to see if the other person is ready to hear it. It means, he said carefully, that a woman who is legally someone's wife is not property under any territory statute currently in existence, and the debts of her prior situation don't transfer. The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear Aurora making small sounds on the floor. She could hear the creak. You're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting, she said. I'm telling you, it's an option, he said. Not a demand, not a condition. An option. We've known each other 5 weeks. I know. That's insane. Probably, he said. It's still an option. She looked at him for a long moment. He sat in the chair with his hands on his knees, and the particular quality of attention he brought to things that were important. The same quality he brought to mending tack or reading his account book, present without performing presence. I don't want to marry someone for legal protection, she said. I understand that, he said. I'm not saying no, she said. I'm saying not like that. He nodded. All right. I'm saying I don't know you well enough, and what I do know, I'm still trying to trust. And even if I trusted it, I don't know what I feel because I've spent 6 years not being allowed to feel things without calculating whether it was safe. And I can't just... She stopped. Her voice had done something she hadn't intended it to do. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. I know, he said. His voice was the same as it always was. Level, unhurried, not managing her, just present. I'm not going to cry, she said. All right, he said. I never cry. All right. She breathed through her nose for a moment. What are you going to do about Aldous? She said, when she had her voice back. What I said. Take the documents apart. Find a lawyer in Millhaven who doesn't owe Aldous anything. Make it expensive to pursue. He looked at her. And I'll do it myself, on my own money, before I ask anything of you. That's not negotiable. She looked at him. She thought about the $1,200. She thought about Margaret, the sister who'd been taken at 17. She thought about a man who'd driven 2 hours through a rainstorm to return to an isolated ranch, alone, and done it enough times that the isolation had become just the shape of his life, uncomplaining, like weather. She thought about the chair she'd taken out from under the door handle. How much will it cost? She asked. More than I'd like, he said. Less than I have. Will it work? He was honest enough to take a moment before answering. I think so. Aldous is a middleman. Middlemen cut their losses when the math turns. If I make this expensive enough, he'll move on to an easier mark. And if he doesn't? Then we figure out what comes next, he said. She looked at him. She looked at Aurora on the floor, who was studying her own hands with intense concentration, apparently finding them remarkable. We, she said. Rowan said nothing, just waited. Okay, Selene said. She stood up from the floor because her back was starting to object to the position, and picked up Aurora. Okay, deal with Aldous, and then... She paused. And then we'll see. That's all I'm asking, he said. She went to put Aurora down for the afternoon nap, and she heard him behind her in the kitchen, pulling out the account book, the one with the slightly pained expression, and beginning to do the math that would cost him more than he'd like. She stood in the doorway of the spare room with Aurora against her shoulder and listened to the scratch of his pencil on the page. It took Rowan 3 weeks and 2 trips to Millhaven to make Aldis's claim too expensive to be worth pursuing. She never saw the full details of what he did. He came back from the second trip looking tired and grimmer than usual and told her it was handled. And when she pressed, he said, "I found 3 structural defects in the original contract, paid a lawyer to document them, and then let it be known through a mutual acquaintance that I was prepared to contest every point in open court and make the whole proceeding as public and protracted as possible." And Aldis backed down, she said. "Aldis has 7 other claims he's working in the territory," Rowan said. "I wasn't worth the trouble." She nodded. She'd expected something like that. Men like Aldis always had other marks. What she hadn't expected was the exhaustion in Rowan's face when he sat down at the kitchen table that evening. Not the tiredness of physical work, which she'd seen on him and which he wore without complaint, but something deeper. The tiredness of someone who'd had to spend time in the company of a world they found genuinely difficult to stomach. She put coffee in front of him without being asked. He looked at it for a moment. "Thank you," he said, and then, "This isn't a comfortable world?" "No," she agreed. I keep thinking it should be more shocking than it is. The yard, Aldis, the way those documents were written like you were furniture that could be claimed under a lien." He shook his head. "And it's not shocking. That's what bothers me. It's just how things work." She sat across from him. "It's how things work for some people," she said. "It's been how things work for me for a long time." She paused. "It's different when you have to look at it from outside, I think. From inside, you stop expecting it to be shocking. You just try to navigate." He looked at her. "How do you stand it?" he asked. Genuinely, without the rhetorical quality the question often had when people asked it. He actually wanted to know. She thought about it. "You don't stand it," she said finally. "You get through it, and you look for the places where it's different, and when you find them, you—" She stopped. She looked at the table. "You try to stay in them long enough to remember what different feels like." The kitchen held them both for a moment. Outside, the last of the daylight was going behind the mountains, which was a process that happened every evening and was never exactly the same twice, the light shifting through specific combinations of cloud and ridge and altitude that produced something new each time, unremarkable and quietly extraordinary. Selene looked at the window and watched it go. "I named her Aurora," she said, after a moment, "because the first morning I woke up here, the light on the mountains looked like something beginning." Rowan followed her gaze to the window. He didn't say anything, but she felt very distinctly the quality of his attention in the room change. Not toward her exactly, but toward both of them, as though he were seeing something he'd stopped hoping was possible, and was being careful not to reach for it too quickly, in case it turned out to be something other than what it appeared. She understood that feeling entirely. Outside, the light kept going. Inside, the coffee cooled slowly in his hands, and neither of them moved to change anything about the moment, which was, she was beginning to learn, sometimes the most important thing you could do. The child appeared on a Thursday morning in early October, when the first real cold had come down from the higher elevations and settled into the clearing like it intended to stay. Selene heard the barn dog bark. One sharp, alarmed sound. Not the drawn-out territorial barking he did when deer came too close to the fence line, but the single declarative note that meant something unexpected and close. She was at the stove with Aurora on her hip, and she set the pan off the heat without thinking and went to the window. There was a small figure at the edge of the tree line. She couldn't tell much from the distance, just the size, which was child-sized, and the stillness, which was the stillness of something that had been moving for a long time and had finally stopped because it didn't know what else to do. The figure stood at the tree line and looked at the house and didn't move. Selene watched for a moment. Then she put Aurora in the basket she used as a carry crib when she needed both hands, pulled her coat off the hook by the door, and went outside. She walked toward the tree line slowly, the way you walk toward something that might bolt. When she got close enough to see clearly, she stopped. The child was a girl, maybe 7, maybe 8. It was hard to tell because she was thin in the way that comes from not eating enough over a sustained period rather than just a bad few days. She had dark hair that had been braided at some point and had since mostly escaped whatever held it. She was wearing a coat that had been made for someone larger, belted closed with a piece of rope. Her boots were on the wrong feet. She looked at Selene with an expression that Selene recognized immediately and completely. The expression of someone who has decided that whatever comes next is probably bad, but they've run out of other options. "Hey," Selene said. She kept her voice level. Not warm exactly. Too much warmth, too fast, reads as false to a frightened child. The same as it reads as false to a frightened adult. Just present. Just human. The girl said nothing. "Are you alone?" Selene asked. A pause, then the smallest nod. "How long have you been out here?" The girl looked at the tree line behind her, then back at Selene. "Since yesterday," she said. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't used it in a while. "Since yesterday morning or yesterday night?" "Yesterday morning." Selene looked at the boots on the wrong feet. She looked at the coat tied with rope. She looked at the way the girl's hands were shaking, which was probably cold but was probably also other things. "Are you hungry?" Selene asked. Another pause, like the girl was calculating whether admitting hunger was safe. "Yes," she said finally. "Okay," Selene said. "Come inside. I have food on the stove." She turned and walked back toward the house without waiting to see if the girl followed, because she remembered, with the kind of precision that only personal experience produces, that being watched while you made a decision about whether to trust someone made the decision harder, not easier. You needed the person to not be looking at you. You needed the space to choose without the pressure of being witnessed choosing. She heard small footsteps behind her on the frozen ground. She kept walking. Inside, she pulled a chair to the stove, the warmest spot in the kitchen, and pointed at it. The girl sat. She was shivering. Selene reheated the pan, put food on a plate, put the plate in front of the girl, and stepped back. She went to the other side of the kitchen and busied herself with Aurora, who had been patient about the interruption and was beginning to indicate, with the specific escalating sounds she used for this purpose, that patience had a limit. The girl ate. She was clearly trying not to eat fast and was losing the battle. Selene noticed and said nothing about it. When the plate was half gone, the girl slowed down enough to look around the kitchen. Her eyes went to Aurora, then back to the plate. "What's her name?" she asked. "Aurora," Selene said. The girl looked at her a moment longer. "She's little." "She is. She's 4 months old." "Is this your house?" Selene paused. It was a question with a complicated answer, but the girl was 7 or 8 and cold and had been in the woods since yesterday morning. "Yes," she said. It felt true enough. "Is there a man here?" Selene looked at her. The way she'd asked it, flat, cautious, the question loaded with prior information, told her something she didn't want to know about what had brought this child to the tree line in a coat tied with rope. "Yes," she said carefully. "His name is Rowan. He's outside working. He's not... You don't need to be afraid of him." The girl looked at the door. "How do you know?" she asked. Selene was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid of him too," she said, "when I first came here. And I was right to be careful. But I've been here 4 months now, and he's never given me a reason to be afraid." The girl absorbed this with the focused, skeptical attention of a child who has learned to evaluate adult statements against available evidence rather than take them on faith. "Okay," she said, not convinced but willing to hold the question open. Rowan came in an hour later and the girl went rigid in her chair the moment she heard his boots on the porch steps. Selene watched it happen. The tightening of every muscle, the hands going flat on the table, the eyes going to the door and staying there. He pushed the door open, stopped when he saw the girl, and didn't come any further in. He looked at Selene. Selene looked at him. Something passed between them that didn't need words. She saw him read the situation, saw him make the adjustments, saw him make the decision to manage himself with care in a way that most men she'd known wouldn't have thought to do. He took off his hat. "Hey," he said to the girl. The girl stared at him. "I'm Rowan," he said. "This is my ranch." He looked at the empty plate on the table. "You hungry still? There's more if you want it." The girl said nothing. "Okay," he said, as if she'd answered. He moved to the wash basin, washed his hands with his back to her, and said, still not looking at her, "What's your name?" A long pause. Lark, the girl said. Lark, he repeated. Good name. He dried his hands. He turned around and sat at the far end of the table, the maximum distance available within the kitchen, and pulled the account book toward him. You can stay as long as you need, he said to the account book. Nobody's going to make you go anywhere tonight. Lark looked at him. She looked at Selene. She looked at her empty plate. Her lower lip did something complicated that she controlled with visible effort. Okay, she said. That night, Selene put Lark in the spare room with Aurora because she'd moved her own things into the larger room 2 months ago when Rowan had suggested, carefully, without pressure, that the original arrangement made less sense as Aurora got older and needed more space. She tucked the blanket around Lark and turned to go. Selene, Lark said. She stopped. Lark had not used her name before. Where did you come from? Lark asked. Before here. Selene turned back. She looked at this small, wary, exhausted child in the bed. From somewhere worse, she said. Like you, I think. Lark looked at her for a moment. Is it better here? She asked. Selene thought about the auction block in the rain. She thought about the chain at her wrist. She thought about $1,200 and a man who'd driven 2 hours through a storm and said, "You owe me nothing." She thought about the chair she'd propped under the door handle and then removed, and the night nothing had happened, and the night after that. Yeah, she said, it's better here. She left the lamp burning low and pulled the door mostly closed. In the kitchen, Rowan was still at the table. He looked up when she came in. She needs to stay, Selene said. It came out more certain than she'd expected, like a decision she'd made in her chest before her brain had finished the deliberation. Rowan looked at her. For how long? He asked. I don't know. She sat down. Maybe until we figure out if there's somewhere she belongs. Maybe longer. She paused. She's afraid of men. Not the normal kind of afraid, the kind that's been taught. His jaw went tight for a moment. Then it released. All right, he said. You're not going to argue with me. No, he said. This is your house. It's your house too, he said. Flatly, the way he said things he'd already made up his mind about and didn't feel needed arguing. She looked at him. She was aware in that moment of how much the shape of things had shifted in 4 months. The way she moved through the rooms without calculating exits, the way she'd stopped waking at every sound from the main hall, the way she'd said, "It's better here" to a frightened child, and had meant it without reservation. She was aware of all of it, and she was also aware of the part of her that watched all of it with suspicion, that kept waiting for the architecture to crack, that had been trained so thoroughly in the certainty of loss that it couldn't stop preparing for it, even when the evidence ran the other direction. She was aware specifically of the thing she felt when she looked at Rowan Mercer across a kitchen table and found him still there, still the same, still exactly who he'd been the day before. She hadn't found a name for that thing yet. She was getting closer. Lark stayed. She folded herself into the rhythm of the ranch the way children fold themselves into available structures, not by deciding to, exactly, but by being present long enough that the structure started to include her. Within a week, she was following Rowan to the barn in the mornings, at a distance of about 10 feet, not talking, just observing. He let her observe without comment. Within 2 weeks, the distance had shortened to 5 feet. By the 3rd week, she was asking questions. They were careful questions, the questions of a child who'd learned that questions could be wrong. What does that do? Rather than, can I try that? Nothing that claimed anything, nothing that assumed she had a right to information or participation. Rowan answered every question with the same lack of ceremony, not making a production of being patient, just actually being patient, in the way that's hard to perform and easy to recognize. Why do you check the horse's feet every morning? Lark asked one day, from her position near the barn door. Stones, Rowan said, lifting the bay mare's front hoof. And splits. Feet are important. You miss something small, it becomes something big. Is that true for people too? He glanced at her. Yeah, he said. It is. Lark thought about that with the serious thoroughness she brought to most things. Selene watched this from the barn doorway with Aurora on her hip, and she felt something shift in the vicinity of her chest, a small, seismic thing, like a weight she'd been carrying redistributing itself. Not lighter exactly, different. She thought, this is what a family looks like when nobody planned it. She thought, I don't know what to do with that. The fever came in November. It came for Aurora first, which was the particular cruelty of fevers in infants. The speed of it, the way a child who had been fine at breakfast could be truly frightening by nightfall. The temperature climbing with the ruthless indifference of a thing that has no awareness of what it's doing. Selene noticed it in the afternoon. The heat coming off Aurora's skin that was wrong, the particular limpness, the way she cried differently. Not the declarative anger of a healthy baby's cry, but something thinner and more desperate. By evening, the fever was high. By midnight, it was higher. Selene had not slept. She sat in the chair beside the bed where she'd laid Aurora, changing the cool cloth on her forehead every few minutes, talking to her in a low, continuous voice that was less about content than about presence. I'm here, I'm right here. While the baby burned and Selene's hands stayed steady through the sheer mechanical force of refusing to let them shake. Rowan came in sometime around 2 in the morning. He didn't ask. He just pulled the second chair to the other side of the bed and sat down with a basin of fresh, cool water and took over the cloths from her without a word, which meant her hands were free, which meant she put her face in them for 30 seconds and did the thing she'd told him she never did. And then she straightened up and took the cloth back. I've had it wrong, she said. Her voice was strange. Not crying, not quite, but something adjacent. What do you mean? He said. I keep thinking... She stopped. She wrung out the cloth and laid it across Aurora's forehead with the practiced efficiency of the last 4 hours. I keep thinking that I've finally gotten to the point where I'm not waiting for the thing I love to be taken. And then this happens, and I think... She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. I think maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I bring it with me. 6 years of everything going wrong, and I should have known that I'd... Selene... He said her name the way he said things that required stopping. She stopped. Babies get fevers, he said. It's not because of you. It's not connected to anything you did or survived or came from. I know that, she said. Do you? She looked at Aurora's small face, flushed and damp, the lashes dark against her cheeks. I'm trying to know it, she said, which was more honest. That's enough, he said. She looked at him across the bed. He looked back at her. He wasn't performing steadiness. He was actually steady. In the way that some people are steady, not because nothing touches them, but because they've made a decision about what to do when things touch them. And they've made that decision so many times it's become the default setting. What if she doesn't get better, Selene said. It was the question she'd been holding away from herself for hours. The question her mind kept producing and she kept refusing to look at directly. She's going to get better, he said. You don't know that. No, he admitted. But I know she's strong. I've watched her for 4 months, and she's strong. Selene looked at Aurora. She screamed at the whole world when she was born, she said. I know, he said. I heard it from the barn. She looked up. What? I was in the barn when you got there, he said. I heard her. He paused. I knew she was going to be something. Selene held that for a moment. Outside, the November wind moved through the pines. The lamp threw warm light across the bed, across the basin, across Rowan's hands, wringing out the cloth with careful efficiency. Lark was asleep in the next room, having refused to go to bed until Selene had promised, twice, that she would come get her if anything changed. She'd finally accepted this on the second promise, which Selene had made with the full weight of her voice behind it. Not the voice she used for routine reassurance, but the voice she'd learned to use for things she meant absolutely. The fever broke near dawn. It happened without drama. No sudden moment, just the gradual return of something normal. The temperature at Selene's palm reading differently against Aurora's forehead, the breathing easing from tight to open. Aurora slept through it. Selene sat beside her and watched the color change in her face from the bad flush to the ordinary pink of a sleeping infant, and she breathed in and breathed out and didn't fall apart, which was the thing she'd been most afraid of. When it was clearly done, when enough time had passed that she could trust it, she put her forehead down on the edge of the bed and stayed there for a while. She heard Rowan's chair move. She heard him get up and move around the bed. She felt his hand on her back. One hand, flat, still. Not rubbing, not patting, just there. The way a hand can communicate that you're not alone without requiring anything from you. She stayed where she was. He kept his hand on her back. I thought I ruined her, Selene said into the blanket. When she got sick, I thought, I thought everything I touch... Stop, he said. Quiet, not harsh. I can't stop. I've been thinking it for 4 months, that I'm going to somehow... that I'm not capable of... Selene. He said it gently, but with weight. You sat with her for 8 hours. You didn't leave. You didn't fall apart. You kept the cloth on her head and talked to her all night. She was quiet. That's not someone who ruins things, he said. That's a mother. She kept her forehead on the edge of the bed. The lamp flickered. Aurora breathed. After a while, Selene sat up. Her face was not what she'd have chosen for it to be, but she was past caring about that. She looked at Rowan, who was crouched beside the bed, his hand still loosely near her shoulder, his face open in a way she hadn't seen it before. Less managed than usual, the weariness of the night on it, real and unguarded. You've been up all night too, she said. So have you. This isn't your... She stopped herself. He looked at her steadily. Yes, it is, he said. She looked at him. She looked at Aurora. She looked at the window where the dark was just beginning to go gray at the edges, that thin seam of early morning that comes before the actual light. There was something she'd been not saying for a while now, something that had been accumulating with the patience of water behind a dam. Not forceful, not urgent, just building, quietly, with the slow certainty of things that are real rather than performed. Rowan, she said. Yeah. I think... She stopped. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and made herself look at him directly. I think I've been in love with you for about 2 months, and I haven't said it because I keep waiting for it to stop feeling like something that's going to hurt me. He was very still. She kept going because stopping now felt worse than finishing. And I know you said, back when Aldous came, that the offer was there and no pressure. And I know it's been months since then, and I haven't said anything. And I'm saying it now not because I'm scared and Aurora just had a fever and I'm emotional, although I am emotional, but because it's true. And I've been carrying it around, and I'm tired of carrying things I don't have to carry. She stopped. The gray at the window was getting lighter. Rowan sat on the edge of the bed, on the other side from Aurora, and looked at her for a long moment with the expression she'd spent months learning, the one that was not performing anything, just attending. The one that had made her trust him before she decided to trust him. I've been in love with you since you told me you named her Aurora because the light looked like something beginning, he said. His voice was very even. I haven't said it because you needed time and I wasn't going to push. She looked at him. That was 2 months ago, she said. I know. We've both been... I know, he said. She laughed, which surprised her. A short, tired, genuine sound. He smiled. Not the careful, contained expression she usually saw, but something more. Something that changed his whole face and made him look younger, which made her think about all the grief he'd carried that she'd only seen the edges of. Aurora made a sound. Both of them looked at her. She was awake. She was looking at the ceiling with the focused, systematic attention she brought to most things, apparently rested and unimpressed by the previous 8 hours of drama. Selene reached out and touched her face, checked the temperature at her forehead. Normal. Hey, she said to Aurora. Welcome back. Aurora grabbed her finger. Rowan watched them both. Okay, Selene said, to the room in general. To him. To herself. Okay. The door opened. Lark appeared in the gap, her hair doing extraordinary things from sleep, wearing the oversized nightgown Selene had found for her. She looked at the bed, assessed Aurora with the rapid efficiency she'd developed for evaluating situations. She okay? Lark asked. She's okay, Selene said. Lark's shoulders dropped about 2 inches. She'd been holding that. Can I come in? She asked. Yes, Selene said. Come in. Lark came in and climbed onto the foot of the bed and sat cross-legged, looking at Aurora with a proprietary expression she hadn't had 4 weeks ago and hadn't decided to have now. It had simply grown on her the way things grow when you water them without noticing. She needs to eat, Lark said. She does, Selene agreed. I can make the oatmeal, Lark said, for after, so you don't have to. Selene looked at her. This small, watchful girl who'd arrived at the tree line in a rope-belted coat, who'd taken 3 weeks to speak directly to Rowan, who checked Aurora's breathing at least twice a night when she thought no one was aware of it. "That would be really good," Selene said. "Thank you." Lark nodded with the dignity of someone who has taken on a meaningful responsibility. She climbed off the bed and went to the kitchen. Rowan and Selene looked at each other over Aurora's head. "She's going to be all right," he said. Selene understood that he meant more than the fever. "Yeah," she said. She did. The weeks after the fever had a different quality than the weeks before it. Something had shifted in the architecture of the house. Not the physical structure, which was the same walls and roof and floor and the curtained windows she'd learned to take for granted, but the interior architecture. The way the rooms felt occupied, the way the table felt when all of them were at it, which was most evenings now. Lark doing her reading at one end while Selene nursed Aurora and Rowan went over whatever the ranch needed attention to. The way the silences had changed, no longer the silences of people being careful around each other, but the silences of people who were comfortable enough to be quiet. She noticed it most in herself. She caught herself, one afternoon in late November, standing on the porch with Aurora while Lark chased the barn dog in circles in the yard and Rowan fixed the fence on the east side, and she was not calculating anything, not the exits, not the next bad thing, not the distance between where she stood and somewhere safer. She was just standing on the porch watching Lark and the dog and feeling something that she finally had a name for. It was the name she'd been looking for since the first morning she'd woken up in this house and felt the absence of threat. It was home. Not safety exactly, because she still knew safety was conditional and the world outside the mountains was what it was, but home. The sense of a place that knew you and held you in it and stayed where you left it. The sense of people who would still be there in the morning. She'd been sold away from every version of home she'd ever had. She'd spent 6 years learning that home was not a thing she was allowed. Standing on the porch in November with her daughter, and the sound of Lark laughing and the sight of Rowan's back bent over the fence line, she let herself understand that she'd been wrong about that. Not about what the world had done to her, Schat. She hadn't been wrong about any of that, but about what the world got to decide for her, permanently. She let herself understand that some things, even after everything, can be rebuilt. Aurora grabbed a fistful of her coat. "Yeah," she said to her daughter. "I know." From across the yard, Lark shouted something at the dog that was half command and half pure delight. The dog ignored her and she ran after it, laughing. Rowan looked up from the fence. He saw Selene on the porch. He held up one hand, not a wave exactly, just an acknowledgement. "I see you. I'm here." She held up her hand back. The mountains held everything steady around them. The cold came in off the peaks and moved through the yard, carrying the smell of pine and altitude and the particular clean emptiness of high places. And Selene breathed it in and let it settle in her chest where the fear used to live. And she didn't pretend it was perfect, because it wasn't. The world was still the world, and they were still who they'd been, and the scars weren't going anywhere. But the scars were hers. She'd earned them, and they'd brought her here. And here was a place she was choosing to stay. That was not nothing. That was in fact the whole thing. He asked her on a Sunday in December, which was not planned. She knew it wasn't planned because of the way it happened. Not arranged, not set up with any of the ceremony that men used when they'd rehearse something. He was splitting the last of the afternoon wood when she came out to tell him supper was close to ready, and he stopped mid-swing and set the axe down and turned around, and she could see on his face that he'd been working up to something and had decided that waiting any longer was its own kind of cowardice. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that your answer doesn't change anything between us. Whatever you say, this is still what it is. I'm not asking to change the stakes." She looked at him. The cold had put color in his face. There was wood shavings on his coat. "All right," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not the way I offered before, not as a legal arrangement, not as protection. I mean, I want you to be my wife, because I want to spend the rest of my life in whatever this is." He gestured slightly awkwardly at the yard, the house, the general shape of everything they'd built in the past 7 months. "And because I think you might want that too, but I didn't want to assume and I didn't want to wait until I was so certain I'd talked myself out of asking." The wind moved through the pines. She stood in the yard in her coat and looked at him, this man who'd paid an impossible price for her and then asked nothing in return. who'd spent 2 years looking for a sister he never found, who answered Lark's careful questions about horses' feet with the same seriousness he gave everything, who had told her she didn't have to be a finished person to deserve a full life. She thought about the chain at her wrist and the rusted nail on the fence post and the night on the auction block in the rain. She thought about the morning she'd walked into his kitchen and stood in the patch of light on the floor and felt, for the first time in 6 years, the absence of threat. She thought about the night Aurora's fever broke and his hand on her back, still, certain. She thought about every version of herself she'd been in the past 6 years, the one who'd learned not to look at faces, the one who'd propped a chair under a door handle, the one who'd said, "I'm not going to cry," and then almost cried anyway. And she thought about how none of those versions had expected to be standing in a mountain clearing in December, being asked this question by this particular man. She had spent 6 years surviving. She had spent the last 7 months learning, slowly, unevenly, with significant backsliding, and more than one night of lying awake waiting for the other shoe to drop, that surviving and living were not the same category of thing. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes?" he said, like he needed to hear it structured that way. "Yes," she said again. "I want to marry you." He let out a breath that had clearly been held for a while. Then he picked the axe back up and set it against the woodpile with the careful deliberateness of a man who needs a moment before he does anything else. And she understood that. Understood the need to do a small, ordinary thing to anchor yourself after something large. Because she did it too. "Supper's ready in about 20 minutes, she said. "All right," he said. She went back inside. At the table, Lark was reading, and Aurora was in the carry basket making the conversational sounds she'd recently developed, apparently describing something at length to the room in general. Selene went to the stove and stirred what needed stirring, and she was very aware of her own face, which was doing something she was having trouble controlling. Lark looked up from her book. She was perceptive, this child, in the way that children are perceptive when they've had to be when reading a room correctly has mattered in practical terms. She looked at Selene's face, and then at the door where Rowan would come in, and then back at Selene. "Did something happen?" she asked. "Yes," Selene said. She found she was smiling, which was not something she'd planned. "Something good." Lark put the book down. "What kind of good?" she asked, with the precise skepticism of someone who understood that good required specifics. "We're going to get married," Selene said. "Rowan and I." Lark was quiet for a moment. "Both of you?" she asked. Selene looked at her. "Yes, Lark. That's generally how it works." Lark absorbed this with the methodical thoroughness she gave all new information. "What does that mean for—" She stopped. She looked at the table. She was working at something, Selene could see, pulling at a question she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. Selene put the spoon down and turned around fully and looked at her. "Ask it," she said. Lark looked up. "Does it mean I have to go somewhere?" she asked. Flat, controlled. The control of a child who'd had to manage their own disappointment for a long time without anyone to hand it to. Selene crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of Lark's chair, which put her at eye level, which was where she needed to be for this. "No," she said. "It doesn't mean that. It means the opposite of that. It means this is your home and we're your family, and that becomes more true, not less." Lark looked at her, searching, as always, for the seam in what was being shown. "You mean it?" she said. "I mean it exactly," Selene said. "I have never meant anything more in my life." Lark's face did something she couldn't quite contain, something that was trying very hard to stay managed and wasn't entirely succeeding. "Okay," she said, very small. "Okay," Selene said. She stood up, went back to the stove, and they both pretended the moment hadn't happened, which was also how they did things. Not ignoring them, but giving them room by not over-examining them. Rowan came in 10 minutes later. He washed his hands, sat down, and said nothing unusual, and the four of them had supper in the specific, comfortable noise of a table that's used to itself, Aurora narrating incomprehensibly, Lark reporting on what she'd been reading, Rowan asking questions about it because he was actually curious, Selene eating and listening and feeling the shape of the evening as something she could hold. After supper, while Selene put Aurora down and settled Lark with her nighttime reading, she heard Rowan say something to Lark in the kitchen. She couldn't hear the words from down the hall, but she heard Lark's response, which was short and then quiet. When she came back to the kitchen, Rowan was washing the dishes. "What did you say to her?" she asked. "I told her she was part of this," he said. "Whatever happened next, she was part of it." Selene looked at his back. "What did she say?" "She said, 'I know,'" he said, "which I took as a good sign." Selene picked up a cloth and started drying. They washed dishes in the comfortable silence she'd once found alarming, and now found was one of her favorite things. The shared quiet of people who have enough to say to each other that the silences don't need to be filled. "When?" she asked. "When do you want it to be?" She thought. Not long. She'd never wanted the ceremony of it, the audience of it, the performance. She'd seen what ceremonies were for and who they served, and she wanted none of that. "Spring," she said, "when the wildflowers come in on the east meadow, just us." "Just us," he confirmed. "No circuit preacher," she said. "No judge. No, I don't want anyone from that world touching this." He looked at her then, understanding exactly what she meant by that world without needing it explained. "We can make it legal in Millhaven after, just the paperwork, but the actual part is ours," she said. "Yes," he said. She dried the last dish. "All right," she said. "Spring." Winter settled around the ranch with the particular completeness of mountain winters. Not the brief, half-hearted cold of the lowlands, but the committed structural cold of high elevations that closes in and stays and becomes the entire context of everything. The road to Cutter's Crossing became intermittently impassable. They stocked for it in November, enough that the isolation was a fact rather than a hardship, and the days compressed into the rhythm of cold-weather ranch work. The animals, the wood supply, the maintenance of warmth and structure against a season that tested both. Selene learned, that winter, what it was to be enclosed by a place rather than trapped in it. The distinction was entirely internal, which made it both more fragile and more durable than any external change could have been. She also learned, with some difficulty, that she had feelings she didn't know how to process. Not bad feelings. That was the strange part. The feelings she'd spent 6 years becoming expert at managing were the bad ones, the survival feelings, the ones with sharp edges you learn to handle without cutting yourself. She had no expertise with the other kind. She told Rowan this one evening in January, sitting by the stove after the children were in bed, the fire doing its work while the cold pressed against the walls outside. "I don't know what to do with being happy," she said. She said it like a practical problem, because for her, it was. "I keep waiting for myself to figure out how to hold it without bracing for it to go." He looked at her from his side of the stove. "Does it go?" he asked. "So far?" "No," she admitted. "Then maybe you just let it keep not going," he said, "and see what happens." "That's dangerously simple advice," she said. "I'm a simple man." She looked at him sideways. "You're not a simple man." "I'm a simpler man than you're giving me credit for." "You spent 2 years tracking your sister through 4 territories and learned enough about debt law to dismantle a fraudulent contract," she said. "That's not simple." He was quiet for a moment. "I just do what needs doing," he said. "I've never been able to do much else." She looked at the fire. "I think that's who I want to be," she said. Not performing it, just thinking aloud. Someone who just does what needs doing, not someone calculating 20 steps ahead, just... She paused. "Present." "You already are," he said. She glanced at him. "You've been present every single day since you got here," he said. "The calculating happens on top of it, but underneath, you've been here." She turned that over. "Aurora thinks so too, I'm sure," she said dryly. "Aurora thinks the ceiling is fascinating and that milk appears by magic," he said. "I wouldn't take her word for it." She laughed. The real kind, the unguarded kind that she'd started letting out sometime in October and still sometimes surprised her with its own existence. He smiled at her, and there it was again. That thing that changed his whole face, the one that made her understand she'd been right to stay. February brought a different kind of test. A man came up the road on a gray Tuesday. Not the aggressive arrival of Aldis's buckboard, but a single rider, moving slowly, which was sometimes worse. Selene saw him from the window and felt the old calibration happen in her chest before she'd consciously processed what she was seeing, the body reading the situation and adjusting before the mind had caught up. She watched him come to the gate and stop there, which was the right thing to do. He didn't come through. He called out. Rowan went out. She stayed at the window with Aurora on her hip and watched. The conversation was short. She couldn't hear it. She watched Rowan's posture through it. He didn't close up the way he closed up with men like Aldous. Something in his shoulders was different. After a few minutes, he turned and looked at the house, found her face in the window, and gave the small nod that meant, "It's all right. Come out." She came out. The man at the gate was older, maybe 50, with the worn look of someone who'd had a hard few years stacked on an already hard life. He held his hat in both hands. He looked at Selene with eyes that were red-rimmed and couldn't quite hold still, the eyes of someone who hadn't slept in a while. "Ma'am," he said, "I apologize for coming without warning. My name is Price. I heard in Cutter's Crossing, people said—" He stopped. Started again. "My wife died in October. Fever. I have a daughter 10 weeks old. I can't—" He stopped again. He pressed his hat against his chest. "I can't keep her alive on my own. I don't know how. I've tried for 11 weeks and I don't know how, and she's gonna—" He couldn't finish that sentence. Selene looked at him. She looked at the bundle tied to his chest. She could see it now, the small shape of it, the way he had one hand pressed against it even while holding his hat with the other. She looked at Rowan. Rowan was looking at her, not at the man, at her, because this was her call, and he knew it, and he was not going to make it for her. She looked at Price. "How far did you ride?" she asked. 6 hours, he said. "She slept most of it. She's—" He checked the bundle with anxious hands. "She's okay right now. She's okay." 6 hours. A man who'd ridden 6 hours in February cold with a 10-week-old tied to his chest because someone in a dwindling frontier town had mentioned a mountain ranch where people in trouble found help. She hadn't known anyone was saying that about them. "Come inside," she said. "Get warm. We'll talk." Price's face did something that was too raw and unmanaged to look at directly. Selene looked at the gate instead, at the mountain road beyond it, at the gray February sky. She heard him say "thank you" in a voice that was barely voice at all. She nodded and walked to the house. Inside, she sat with the baby while Price warmed himself at the stove. Rowan put coffee on without being asked. Lark came in from the back room and immediately went to look at the baby, the way she went to look at all small things that needed looking at, with focused, proprietary assessment. "She's hungry," Lark said. "I know," Price said miserably. "I've been trying. I've got what she needs," Selene said. She took the baby from Price's arms without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it harder for both of them, and the baby latched immediately with the desperation of something that had been waiting a long time, and Price made a sound he quickly turned away from them to hide. Rowan handed him coffee. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the sounds of feeding. After a while, Price said, without turning around, "I'm not abandoning her." "I know," Selene said. I need to learn how to keep her, and I can't do it alone in the winter, and I thought—" His voice was very unsteady. "I heard people said you take in—" "People are talking," Rowan said, not unkindly. "Word travels." Price turned around then. He looked at the baby in Selene's arms, and the look on his face was the most complicated thing she'd seen since the morning she'd first looked at Aurora on the auction block. Grief and love and helplessness, and the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been holding something precious alone and was terrified of dropping it. "Her name's Clara," he said. "That's a good name," Selene said. "Her mother picked it." He sat down at the table. He put his hands around the coffee cup. "I don't know anything about babies. I knew nothing, and she knew everything. And now she's gone, and I have this small person who needs everything, and I—" He stopped. "You learn," Selene said. "You learn because you have to, and it's hard, and you get it wrong sometimes, and you keep going anyway." He looked at her. She thought about what she knew of learning, and what she knew of having no choice, and what she knew of small persons who needed everything, and she said, "You can stay for a while. We have room, and you can learn what you need to learn, and when you're ready to take her home, you'll take her home." Rowan looked at her across the kitchen. She looked back at him. "We have room," he confirmed. Price looked between them. "Why?" he asked, not suspiciously. The question of a man who'd been told hard things dressed as gifts before and needed to understand the structure of what was being offered. Selene thought about how to answer that. She thought about the auction block, and the quiet voice, and the words "you owe me nothing," and what those words had done to the architecture of the next year of her life. "Because someone did it for me," she said, "and now I can." Price nodded. He looked down at the coffee cup. "Thank you," he said again. And this time she let herself receive it without deflecting, because she was learning that too. That accepting gratitude gracefully was its own kind of practice, and she was still at the beginning of it. Clara stayed 3 weeks. Price stayed with her, learning, slowly, clumsily, with the particular determination of a father who had decided that incompetence was not a permanent condition. How to hold her, how to read her, how to do the 100 small things that keeping an infant alive requires, and that look impossible from the outside until they become routine. Lark appointed herself his unsolicited instructor, which was so perfectly Lark that Selene had to leave the room the first time she witnessed it. "You're holding her wrong," Lark said on day 2, from her position of 8-year-old authority. Price blinked. What? "You're holding her like she might break. She won't break, but she can feel that you're scared, and it scares her." Price looked at the baby, then at Lark, then at Rowan, who kept his face entirely neutral. "She's right," Selene said, from the stove. "Hold her like you mean it." He tried. It took a few days. But by the end of the first week, Clara had stopped the thin, frightened crying she'd come in with and had started the louder, more indignant crying of a baby whose needs were being met often enough that she'd developed opinions about timing. "That's better," Lark said, listening to it. "Now she sounds like Aurora." "Aurora is extremely opinionated," Price said. "All the good ones are," Lark said, with a confidence that made Rowan set down his coffee and find something to look at across the room. When Price left with Clara at the end of the 3rd week, he shook Rowan's hand and then, with visible effort, extended his hand to Selene. She shook it. He looked at her, and then at the house, and then back at her. "I'm going to tell people about this place," he said. "You don't need to," Selene said. "I know I don't need to," he said. "I'm going to anyway." She watched him ride down the mountain road with Clara tied against his chest, and his posture completely different from the broken man who'd come up it 3 weeks ago, and she stood at the gate until he was out of sight. Rowan came to stand beside her. "We're going to get a reputation," he said. "We already have one, apparently," she said. He was quiet. "Is that all right with you?" he asked. She thought about it. She thought about what it would mean. More people up the road, more Price-like situations, more exhausted, frightened arrivals with more complicated needs. She thought about what it would ask of them, and of the children, and of this quiet clearing they'd built something in. She thought about what it meant that people were talking about them, that somewhere in the frontier towns and crossing points and supply stops of the territory, there was a thing being said about a mountain ranch where the door wasn't locked. She thought about what it would have meant to her 8 months ago to hear someone say a place like that existed. "Yes," she said. "It's all right with me." They went back inside because the cold was genuine and there was supper to think about, and Lark was almost certainly doing something inadvisable with the barn dog. But before they reached the porch, she stopped and turned to him. "Rowan." "Yeah." "When spring comes," she said, "the wildflowers on the east meadow." He looked at her. "I want to do it right," she said. "I want to say the things out loud, the real things, not the legal language. I want to mean it in the open air." She paused. "I want the girls there." "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly right." She looked at the mountains, which were the same mountains they'd always been. Indifferent and enormous and spectacular in the way of things that have existed long before any of this, and will exist long after. "I'm going to take your name," she said. He was very still. "I know that's not—" She felt her way through it. "I know it's not required. I know I could keep my own. But Selene Crow was a name I was given and kept by default because there was no other option. I want a name I chose." She looked at him. "I want to choose yours." He looked at her with the open, unguarded expression that still caught her off guard sometimes, the one that appeared when he wasn't managing himself, when something simply reached him before he could organize a response. "Okay," he said. His voice was not quite level, which was rare enough that she noticed. "Selene Mercer," she said, trying it aloud. "Selene Mercer," he repeated. It sounded, she thought, like a person who'd been somewhere and come out the other side. Not unchanged, that was never the story, but intact, chosen, deliberate. It sounded like hers. The spring came late that year, the way mountain springs come, reluctantly, with setbacks, the snow returning twice after it seemed to have given up, the ground taking its time to commit to anything. But it came. The East Meadow ran with wildflowers in May, the first blue ones going in before the ground was entirely certain, the yellow ones following, and then by mid-May, the whole meadow was a declaration that winter was done. They married on a Tuesday, which was not symbolic. It was simply the day the weather was best that week. Lark wore a dress Selene had made from the softest fabric she could find in the Millhaven supply store, which had required compromise on both their parts about what constituted appropriate clothing and what was simply Lark's strong opinion about buttons. Aurora, at nearly 9 months old, was carried by Rowan and spent the ceremony attempting to eat his collar, which she found significantly more interesting than the proceedings. There was no preacher, no judge, no audience, just the four of them in the East Meadow, and the words Selene had been thinking about since December. Not elaborate, not performed, just the things that were true. "I spent a long time not believing I got to have this," she said. She was looking at him, and the meadow was behind him, and the mountains were behind that, and the sky was the specific blue that only happens at altitude in May. "And I want you to know that I know how rare it is. I know what this cost you, and what it cost me, and what we had to come through to be standing here." She paused. "I'm not promising to be easy because I won't be. I'm not promising to be healed because I'm not. I'm promising to stay, and to tell you the truth, and to let you do the same." He looked at her. "I've been alone in this place for a long time," he said, "and I told myself it was all right, that it was just the shape of things, and I believed it enough to keep going." He glanced at Lark, at Aurora, trying to defeat his caller, at the meadow and the mountains. "I was wrong about that. This is the shape of things. You and them and whatever comes next." He paused. "I'm not promising to be perfect either, but I'm promising to be here. Every morning you wake up in that house, I'll be there." Lark, who was standing very straight with her hands folded in front of her with the gravity of someone who understood this was important, looked between them. "Is that it?" she asked. "That's it," Selene said. "So now you're married?" "Now we're married," Rowan said. Lark considered this for a moment. "Okay," she said, and then, after a pause, "Can we eat? You said there was cake." There was, in fact, cake, a lopsided one that Selene had made the previous evening from a recipe she'd found in the back of an old book on the kitchen shelf, and which had turned out reasonably well on the inside and enthusiastically imperfect on the outside, which felt appropriate. They ate it in the meadow, with the wildflowers around them, Aurora redistributing her share across Rowan's shirt with systematic thoroughness, Lark eating her piece with the focused appreciation of someone who considered cake a serious undertaking. Selene sat in the grass with the sun on her face and looked at the three of them and held the moment, not because she was trying to preserve it. She'd learned by now that you couldn't hold moments still, that they moved whether you wanted them to or not, but because she wanted to be fully inside it while it was happening. This was what she had. This imperfect, lopsided, wildflower-ringed, collar-eating, cake-redistributing life that she had walked into through a door she'd almost not trusted to open. She was, she realized, sitting in the East Meadow with wildflowers in her hair and cake on her hands, inside something she had once believed was not available to her. Not a perfect life, not a safe world, not the erasure of anything she'd been through, just this, just here, just chosen. She looked over at Rowan, who was attempting to negotiate with Aurora about the collar situation and losing. He caught her looking. He smiled. She smiled back, the real kind, the unguarded kind, the kind she'd been learning to let exist without bracing for what came after. The mountains held their position. The meadow said nothing, which is what meadows do. And Selene Mercer, new name, old scars, whole self, sat in the May sun and let herself have it. Price had been right about one thing. Word traveled. It traveled the way things travel in frontier country, not through newspapers or official channels, but through the network of people who talk to other people who are trying to survive. The informal cartography of places where a person in trouble might find something other than more trouble. A name passed between two women at a supply store in Cutter's Crossing became a direction given to a man on a road outside Millhaven, became a piece of information whispered in the back of a wagon carrying people who needed to know where the roads led. The mountain ranch with the unlocked door, the woman who'd been through it, and the man who'd opened the gate. By the time summer settled full into the clearing, August heat pushing up even into the high elevation, the creek running lower than spring, the garden producing more than they could eat, Selene had stopped being surprised by arrivals, not stopped being affected by them. That was different. Each one still landed somewhere real in her chest. Each story still required something of her that wasn't nothing. But the surprise had given way to something more like readiness. The way a person who has done a hard thing enough times develops a muscle for it that didn't exist before. There had been 7 arrivals since Price. Not all of them stayed. Some needed a meal and a night's sleep and directions to somewhere specific they were trying to reach. Some needed more than that and stayed weeks. One woman, a quiet person named Delia, who'd come up the road in June with a bruised face and very little else, had been with them 2 months now and showed no signs of leaving, which none of them had mentioned directly because mentioning it directly would have made it a question when it was more comfortable as just a fact. Delia helped with his garden. She was extraordinary with growing things in a way that suggested a long history with soil and patience, and the garden had responded to her attention the way living things respond to being genuinely cared for, extravagantly, almost embarrassingly. By August, the beds were producing so much that Selene had started preserving in earnest, filling the root cellar with the kind of systematic thoroughness that made Rowan observe one evening that they were either preparing for a very productive winter or planning to feed a considerably larger number of people than currently occupied the house. "Maybe both," Selene said, without looking up from the jar she was sealing. He looked at her. "How much larger?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I've been thinking about the North Outbuilding." He was quiet for a moment. The North Outbuilding was currently storage, wood, tools, winter supplies. It was also, structurally, sound enough to be more than that with some work. "That would take most of the fall to make livable," he said. "I know," she said. "I thought you could start in September." He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the window, which showed the clearing in the late summer evening light, the garden Delia had coaxed into abundance, the barn where Lark was almost certainly visiting the horses past the time she'd been told to come in. "All right," he said. She looked up then. "You're not going to argue," she said. "What would I argue?" he said. "You're right." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't know what I'm planning." "You're planning to make this place bigger," he said, "so it can hold more people who need holding. I don't see what there is to argue with." She set the jar down. "It's going to cost money we could use for other things," she said. "It's going to take time and work. It's going to make things complicated in ways I can't fully anticipate." "Yes," he said, to all of it, "and you're fine with that." He looked at her the way he'd always looked at her, attending, specific, the full weight of his attention without the performance of it. "Selene," he said, "I paid $1,200 for a stranger in a cattle yard because of my sister, and it turned out to be the best thing I've ever done. I think my judgment on the value of complicated things that cost more than expected is probably trustworthy at this point." She held his gaze. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She picked the jar back up. "September," she said. "September," he confirmed. The thing about building something real, Selene had learned, was that it happened in the wrong order. You didn't feel stable and then build. You built first, with shaking hands, an incomplete understanding, and more uncertainty than felt survivable. And the stability came after, assembled piece by piece from the results, until one day you looked around and realized the structure had become load-bearing without you noticing exactly when. She thought about this in the morning sometimes, standing on the porch with coffee while the clearing came awake around her. Aurora was walking now, unsteady, aggressive, deeply committed to reaching whatever she'd fixed her attention on regardless of obstacles, which was a personality trait that had been present since the auction block and showed no signs of moderating. Lark had grown 2 inches since October and had begun to develop opinions about everything that were clearly her own rather than adopted from the adults around her, which Selene considered one of the best possible signs. Delia moved through the garden in the early morning quiet, doing whatever she did to things that grew, and the garden responded, and the root cellar filled, and the North Outbuilding was framed out now and would be ready before first snow. The ranch had changed shape. Not dramatically. From the road, it still looked like what it was, a working mountain property with practical structures and functional fencing and the organized bones of a place run by people who knew what they were doing. But inside the fence line, inside the house, in the texture of the days, it was something it hadn't been a year ago. It was the place people came to when the other places had failed them. She hadn't planned to be that. She wasn't sure Rowan had either, though she thought he'd had something like it somewhere in the back of his mind since Margaret. Since the 2 years of looking and the leads that ended and the grief that had to go somewhere useful or just go on being grief. She thought when he'd stood in the back of the crowd at Harlan's yard and named his price, he'd been acting on something he'd carried a long time and finally found a use for. She thought about that sometimes. The strange alchemy of loss, how it could transform, if you let it, and sometimes, even if you didn't, into something that reached beyond itself. She wasn't glad for what had happened to her. She was never going to arrive at glad. But she had stopped waiting to arrive at glad, which was its own kind of progress. The story of her first 18 years was not one she'd have chosen, and the fact that it had led her here didn't redeem it, didn't make it necessary, didn't mean it had to happen that way. Suffering didn't have to be meaningful to be real. She knew that. She refused the version of her own life that required her to be grateful for what broke her in order to appreciate what she'd built. What she'd built in spite of it, not because of it. That distinction mattered to her. It still does. It was late August when the last piece arrived, as it often did, without warning and at an inconvenient time. She was in the middle of a disagreement with Lark about the barn when she heard the horse on the road. Not a wagon this time, a single horse, moving with the specific uncertain rhythm of a rider who didn't know exactly where they were going and was hoping to find it anyway. She came out of the barn to see. The rider was a man she didn't recognize, maybe 40, with a dust-covered coat and the look of someone who'd been riding for several days. He had something under his coat. She saw it before she registered what it was, the bulk of it, the way he had one arm held across his chest protectively. He stopped his horse at the gate. "I'm looking for the Mercer Ranch," he said. His voice was hoarse. "You found it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached under his coat and brought out what he'd been holding, and she understood immediately why he'd come. The infant was very small, too small for its age, she thought, and she had enough experience now to read that at a glance. Thin and pale and quiet in a way that infants are not supposed to be quiet. "Her mother died 3 days ago," the man said. "I'm her father's brother. He stopped. "He didn't make it either. Fever took them both inside a week. She's all I have left of them, and I've been riding since I heard about this place, and I don't—" He looked at the baby, then at Selene. "I can't keep her. I have nothing. I've got a claim that failed and debts and nowhere she'd survive the winter. But I couldn't leave her." His voice broke on the last words in the specific way voices break when someone has been holding something for too many days. "I couldn't just leave her." Selene looked at the baby. She looked at this man on an exhausted horse who had ridden days to find a place he'd heard about from someone who'd heard about it from someone else, because there was nothing else he could do, and he refused to do nothing. She thought about Cass, the gray-haired woman in the adjacent pen at Harlan's yard, who talked her through the breathing and called her girl and disappeared into somewhere Selene had never been able to find. She thought about what it meant to reach for people in the dark, not knowing if anything would reach back, and do it anyway. She opened the gate. "Come inside," she said. "Give her to me." He handed the baby over with the profound, exhausted relief of someone releasing a weight they've been terrified to drop. His hands were shaking. She noticed but didn't mention it. The baby was light. Too light, she confirmed, holding her properly now, feeling the smallness of her. But she was warm. She was breathing in the rapid, shallow rhythm that Selene had learned to read as serious but not immediate. Her eyes, when Selene looked, were open. Not the glazed nothing of a baby in real crisis, but present. Looking. Taking in what was in front of her. "Hey," Selene said, to this small person who'd lost both parents in a week and been carried on horseback for 3 days by an uncle who had nothing. "Hey, we've got you." The baby looked at her face. She did not look away. Rowan came out of the north outbuilding at the sound of voices, saw the situation, and came to the gate without needing the shape of it explained. He brought the man's horse around to the barn. He brought the man inside and gave him water and food and the chair by the stove and asked no questions for a while because he understood the order of things. That a person who has been holding on for days needs to stop holding on before they can talk. And talking before that happens produces something less than the truth. Lark came in from whatever she'd been doing and stopped in the kitchen doorway, assessed the scene, and looked at the baby in Selene's arms. "Another one?" she said. "Her name is—" Selene looked at the uncle, whose name turned out to be Samuel. "Wren," Samuel said. "Her mother wanted Wren." "Wren," Selene repeated. Lark came forward and looked at Wren with the authoritative attention she brought to all small creatures that came under this roof. "She's too thin," Lark said. "She is," Selene agreed. "We can fix that," Lark said, with absolute confidence. The confidence of a child who had arrived at a tree line a year ago in a rope-belted coat with her boots on the wrong feet, who had been fixed herself by nothing more complicated than time and consistency and people who stayed, and who therefore knew, with the particular conviction of personal evidence, that it was possible. Selene looked at her. Sometimes Lark did things that made Selene have to look away for a moment, not because they were sad, but because they were so completely the opposite of sad that she didn't have a prepared response. "Yeah," she said. "We can." Samuel stayed 4 days. He slept for most of the first 2, which told Selene everything about the previous week. By the 3rd day, he was able to sit at the table and talk, and he told them about his brother and his brother's wife, about the claim they'd been working and the fever that had come through in July and taken 3 people on adjacent claims before it took them. He told them about finding Wren alone in the cabin, 3 days old, and not being able to think of a single correct response except to pick her up and start writing. "I heard about your place from a man named Price," he said, "at a trading post 2 weeks ago. He said you were people who helped." He looked at Selene. "He said a woman here had been through it herself, and that made the difference." Selene was quiet for a moment. "Price doing all right?" she asked. "He had his daughter on his back when I talked to him," Samuel said. "She looked healthy. He looked like he knew what he was doing." A pause. "He said you taught him." She thought about Price in her kitchen, learning to hold Clara like he meant it because Lark had told him to, and she'd confirmed it from the stove. "We all figured it out together," she said. On Samuel's last morning, he stood in the yard with his horse, ready to go back to the failed claim and the debts and whatever came next, which he had no clear picture of, but was clearly going to face anyway, because that was the only direction available. He looked at Wren, who was in Selene's arms and was, already, eating better, already warmer, already looking at the world with more presence than she'd had 4 days ago. "I'll come back for her," he said, "when I have something to come back with. I'm not abandoning her." "I know," Selene said. "You'll keep her. Until then." "We'll keep her," she confirmed. He looked at the house, the north outbuilding, framed out and waiting. The garden. Lark visible through the kitchen window, apparently explaining something to Delia with considerable animation. Aurora's small voice, coming from somewhere in the direction of the barn, raised in the declarative tone she used when she'd found something interesting. "How did this happen?" he asked, not rhetorically, actually wanting to know. Selene thought about it. "One at a time," she said. "Nobody planned it. We just kept saying yes when the next thing came." He nodded slowly. "Must have been a hard yes sometimes," he said. "Every time," she said. "Doesn't mean it was wrong. He rode away down the mountain road and she watched him go, and she held Wren against her shoulder and she thought, yes, that's exactly it. Every time it was hard and every time they did it anyway, and this was what you accumulated when you kept doing the hard thing. Not ease, not the absence of difficulty, but something more durable than either of those. You accumulated a life." She went back inside. The kitchen was full. Delia at the counter, Lark at the table with a book she was only pretending to read because she was actually watching Wren. Rowan coming in from outside with the concentrated look of a man calculating how many weeks until the north outbuilding would be genuinely finished. Aurora came in behind him, navigating the door with the aggressive confidence of a toddler who had decided that obstacles were a suggestion and made immediately for the basket where Wren was now lying. "Careful," Selene said. "Baby," Aurora said, pointing at Wren with the information delivery tone she used for things she felt needed announcing. "Yes," Selene confirmed. "Baby, be gentle." Aurora patted Wren's arm with the exaggerated delicacy of someone performing gentleness rather than feeling it, But the intention was there, and Wren looked at her with the focused blankness of a newborn encountering another small human for the first time. Lark put the book down entirely. She's looking at Aurora. Babies look at things, Rowan said, hanging his coat. She's specifically looking at Aurora, Lark said, with the authority of someone who had studied the matter. Rowan caught Selene's eye across the kitchen. She pressed her lips together. All right, she said. Everybody needs to eat. Lark, put the book away. Delia, is there bread left from this morning? Half a loaf, Delia said. Good. That and whatever's in the pot. The kitchen moved into the organized noise of supper preparation, which had its own rhythm by now. Who stood where, who handled what, the choreography of 5 people and 2 small children in a space that had learned to hold them. It wasn't elegant. It involved minor negotiations and occasional drop things, and at one point a full disagreement between Lark and Delia about whether the pot needed more salt that went unresolved because both of them were right in different ways. Rowan ate standing up because he'd come in late and Aurora had claimed his chair, and he looked at the chair and looked at Aurora occupying it with complete confidence and simply went to the counter. None of it was smooth. None of it was what either Selene or Rowan would have designed if they'd designed anything. It was the result of choices made in moments of fear and exhaustion and grief and the stubborn refusal to stop when stopping would have been easier. And it looked like what it was, real, accumulated, fully inhabited. Selene stood at the stove and watched it. She thought about the auction block. She thought about the rusted nail on the fence post that she'd fixed her eyes on so she wouldn't look at the faces. She thought about a wagon in the rain and a quiet voice and 3 words that had rearranged the entire remaining shape of her life. She thought about all the things she'd been told, explicitly and implicitly, over 6 years, about what she was worth and what she was allowed and what categories of life were available to a person like her. She thought about how thoroughly she'd believed those things, or learned to move through the world as if she believed them, which was close enough to the same thing that the difference barely mattered. She thought about what it had taken to stop believing them. Not a single moment, not a revelation, not anything dramatic or clean, just time. And one person after another who stayed, and the slow, grinding, unspectacular work of allowing herself to be somewhere without preparing to leave it. She thought about what she wanted Wren to know someday, when Wren was old enough for knowing, and Aurora, and Lark, who already knew some of it and was still learning the rest. She wanted them to know that the world was genuinely hard and often unfair, and that this was not something to be fixed by optimism or denied by looking away from it. She wanted them to know that they would be let down, sometimes by people who should have known better, and sometimes by circumstances that had nothing to do with anyone's intentions. She wanted them to know that pain left marks, and that marks were allowed, and that a person did not have to be unmarked to deserve a full life. She wanted them to know that freedom was not the absence of fear. She had been afraid every single day since the auction block. She was afraid sometimes now, of loss, of the world outside the mountains, of all the ways the people she loved could be hurt. Freedom was not the absence of that. Freedom was doing the thing anyway, choosing anyway, staying anyway. She wanted them to know that love was not something that arrived fully formed and required only acceptance. It was a practice. It was the daily choice to remain present to another person's reality, including the parts that were inconvenient or painful or not what you'd have chosen. It was Rowan sitting across a kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a basin of cool water because he'd decided that what happened to Aurora happened to him. It was Lark telling a grieving father he was holding his baby wrong because she loved that baby, and love sometimes looked like correction. It was Delia in the garden, putting her hands in the earth every morning because the earth was something she knew how to care for, and caring for it was how she was reassembling herself. It was, she thought, what it had always been. Ordinary people making extraordinary choices in ordinary moments, without knowing if it would work, without any guarantee, just doing it because the alternative was to not do it, and the not doing was not acceptable. Selene, Rowan said from the counter. She looked at him. You're not stirring, he said. She looked at the pot. She'd stopped stirring without noticing. Right, she said. She stirred. After supper, after Wren was fed and Aurora was wrestled into sleep, and Lark had been persuaded that she was also tired, even though she was emphatically not tired, and this was simply a rumor, And also she needed 5 more minutes, which became 10, which became her asleep with the book still open on the blanket. After all of that, Selene went out to the porch. It was the hour she'd come to guard. Late enough that the clearing was dark except for the stars, which at altitude were a specific abundance that still arrested her, sometimes even after a year of seeing them. The creek was audible. The pines moved in whatever way pines moved when the wind came down from the higher peaks, which was a sound she'd never heard before coming to this place and now couldn't imagine not hearing. She stood on the porch and looked at the clearing and looked at the mountains, which were dark shapes against a darker sky. Enormous and indifferent, and somehow, despite all of that, comfortable. Rowan came out after a while and stood beside her. "Wren's good," he said. "I checked." "I know," she said. "I checked first." "I know you did," he said. "I checked anyway." She looked at the stars. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what this is." She gestured at the clearing, the house, the north outbuilding with its framed walls, the full garden, and the gate that didn't lock. "What we've made here." He waited. "I think we made a place where people can stop running," she said, "even for a little while, long enough to remember their people instead of problems." She paused. "I think that's what it is." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what I was trying to make you," he said, "when I brought you here. I didn't know if it would work." "It didn't right away," she said. "No. It took time." "Everything does." She looked at the mountains. "I was so afraid," she said, "for so long. I don't think I understood how afraid I was until I wasn't quite as afraid. That's the strange thing. Fear is loudest after it starts to quiet, because then you can hear it." He didn't say anything, just listened, which was what he did when she was working through something. "I think I'm still afraid sometimes," she said. "I don't think that goes away completely, but it's not. It's not the whole thing anymore. It used to be the whole thing." "What is it now?" he asked. She thought about it. "One part of a larger thing," she said. "The part that reminds me to pay attention, to not take it for granted." She turned and looked at him. "Rowan." "Yeah. I'm glad you were there," she said. "At the yard. I'm glad it was you." He looked at her. "I'm glad it was you too," he said. Simple. Certain. The flat conviction of someone who'd had time to be sure. She turned back to the mountains. They stood together in the dark on the porch of a house that had started as one man's grief and one woman's survival and become something that neither of them had words for in advance, something that was still growing, still changing shape, still saying yes when the road brought the next person to the gate. Somewhere inside, Wren slept. Aurora dreamed whatever small, fierce dreams Aurora dreamed. Lark slept with her book, which was where it would stay until morning, when she would pick it up and say she'd been reading it all along and nobody could prove otherwise. Delia's light was still on in the back room, which meant she was still up, which was her choice and her life, and she'd find her way to sleep when she was ready. The creek ran. The mountains stayed where mountains stay. And Selene Mercer, who had been born into nothing, sold into worse, and built herself back from the raw material of refusal and time, and the unexpected mercy of one man's guilt transformed into something better than guilt, stood on her porch under the frontier stars and understood, without ceremony or conclusion, that this was it. Not the end of hard things, not the resolution of all that had broken, just this. A woman who had survived everything the world threw at her, and had not only survived it, but had turned it into a door she kept open. The world had tried to sell her life. She had built, from the same raw material, something the world could not price, a home that fear could not break, a name she had chosen, a family held together not by blood or law or obligation, but by the oldest and most durable force available to people who have been through the worst and come out the other side still willing, the choice to stay.